On the 7th of September, 1533, the sun rose over the Thames a little after 5 in the morning, and by the time its light reached the leaded windows of Greenwich Palace, the household of the Queen of England had already been awake for hours. Somewhere behind those windows, in a chamber hung with fresh tapestries and scented with rosewater, and the particular coppery smell of childbirth, a woman lay exhausted in a bed built for a king's son. She was 20 months into the most dangerous gamble any woman in England had ever made. She had waited nearly 7 years for this moment, through broken promises, through a divided church, through the fury of a scorned queen, through the whispered hatred of half the country. She had reshaped a kingdom's relationship with Rome so that this child, whoever it turned out to be, could be born a legitimate heir rather than a royal bastard. Everyone in that room believed the child would be a boy. The physicians had said so. The astrologers had said so. Letters had already been drafted in advance, announcing the birth of a prince. The documents were sitting nearby with a blank space where a single letter would need to be added, S, to turn prince into princess, in case the physicians and astrologers turned out to be wrong. They turned out to be wrong. At some point that morning a cry went up, not the cry of triumph the palace had prepared for, but something quieter, more uncertain. A girl, small, dark-haired, red-faced, entirely healthy, and utterly, catastrophically, the wrong sex. The woman in the bed was Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. The infant, hastily wrapped and carried to be shown to a court already unsure how to react, would grow up to become Elizabeth I, one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. But nobody in that room on the 7th of September could have known that. All they knew was that the king had wanted a son, that the king had broken with the Roman Catholic Church for the promise of a son, and that the woman who had promised him one had just handed him a daughter instead. 3 years later, almost to the day, that same woman would be dead, beheaded on the orders of the same man who had once dismantled a kingdom's faith to marry her. How did a woman go from the centre of a king's obsession to a corpse in an unmarked grave inside the Tower of London in less than a decade? How did the birth of a healthy child become, in the eyes of history, the beginning of the end? To understand what happened in that room in 1533, and everything that followed, we have to go back to the beginning, not to a queen, not even, at first, to a king's mistress, but to a little girl growing up in the Kentish countryside in a family that was climbing, carefully and relentlessly, toward the only place in England that mattered, the court of Henry VIII.
Welcome to the Sleepy Historian channel. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.
We do not know with certainty the year Anne Boleyn was born. This is one of the first things to understand about her story. For a woman whose final years are recorded in exhaustive, sometimes excruciating detail, trial transcripts, ambassadors' letters, eyewitness accounts of her execution, her childhood is almost a blank page. Historians have argued for over a century between two dates, 1501 and 1507, and the debate has never been fully settled. What we do know is that she was born at Hever Castle or Blickling Hall, into a family that was, by the standards of the English gentry, remarkably successful at climbing. Her father was Thomas Boleyn, a courtier and diplomat of considerable skill, fluent in French, ambitious, and unusually good at making himself useful to powerful people. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from one of England's great aristocratic houses, the Howards, Dukes of Norfolk, a family that had survived shifting royal favour for generations by being exceptionally good at reading which way the wind was blowing. Anne had 2 siblings who survived to adulthood, an older sister, Mary, and a brother, George. All 3 would eventually be swept into the innermost circles of the Tudor court. None of them would leave it unscathed. The Boleyns were not old nobility in the way the Howards were. They were something more interesting, a family that had risen from trade through marriage and ambition in the span of only a few generations. Anne's great-grandfather had been a mercer, a cloth merchant who became Lord Mayor of London. Every generation since had married a little higher, positioned itself a little closer to power. Thomas Boleyn was in many ways the culmination of that project, a man who did not merely serve the crown, but was trusted with its most delicate business abroad. That trust would shape his daughter's entire life, because in 1513 Thomas Boleyn secured Anne a position most English girls of her class could barely dream of, a place in the household of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, at her glittering court in Mechelen. We should pause on what this meant. Anne was sent, likely still a child by modern reckoning, to be raised not in an English household, but in one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, a place of humanist scholarship, French manners, music, dance, and a level of polish that the English court, for all its wealth, could not match. Margaret of Austria herself wrote to Thomas Boleyn that she found his daughter charming and well-mannered. It was an extraordinary compliment for a girl still learning who she was. Within a year, Anne moved again, this time to France, into the household of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's own sister, who had just been married off to the elderly King Louis XII in a diplomatic match designed to seal peace between England and France. When Louis died only months later, Mary Tudor returned home, but Anne did not go with her. Instead, she stayed in France, entering the household of the new queen, Claude, wife of the young and dazzling Francis I. She would remain at the French court for the better part of 7 years. This is in some ways the most important and least discussed chapter of Anne Boleyn's life, because it is where she stopped being simply the daughter of an ambitious English courtier and became something the English court had almost never produced on its own, a woman shaped entirely by French sophistication. She learned to dance in the French style, to dress in it, to debate in it, to flirt in it. She absorbed the intellectual currents moving through the French court, including the early stirrings of religious reform ideas that would later matter enormously to her own life and to the future of England itself. She read French poetry. She observed, at close range, a queen's court running not on English formality but on wit, performance, and a kind of controlled seduction that had almost nothing to do with anything Anne would have learned had she stayed at home. We do not know exactly what Anne looked like. No confirmed portrait from her lifetime survives with certainty. Most images we have today were painted after her death, based on descriptions and lost originals, which is itself a small but telling detail about how quickly her image was contested even by people who claim to remember her. What contemporaries agreed on was not conventional English beauty. She was dark-haired, dark-eyed, olive-complexioned in an era that prized fair skin, and by more than one account not considered a great beauty by the standards of the day. What she had instead, and what nearly everyone who met her commented on, was something harder to paint: wit, magnetism, a way of holding a room that had nothing to do with her face. She was, in short, being built, not deliberately, not as any single person's plan, but through the accumulated effect of her family's ambitions and her own long exile abroad, into a woman who did not resemble anyone else at the English court. And in late 1521 or early 1522, her father called her home. She had no way of knowing it yet, but she was about to walk into the most dangerous room in England, to understand why Anne Boleyn's return to England mattered, to understand why a courtier's daughter with continental polish would eventually become the most consequential woman in English history. We need to step back from Anne herself and look at the kingdom she was walking into. At the time, this may have seemed to have nothing to do with a young woman recently returned from the French court, but it would eventually determine the entire course of her life. England in the early 1520s was ruled by Henry VIII, a king who had inherited his throne almost by accident. Henry was not supposed to be king. He had an older brother, Arthur, who was raised from birth to inherit the crown, and who had been married in 1501 to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon, a match designed to bind England to one of the most powerful royal houses in Europe. But Arthur died only months after the wedding, at 15 years old, leaving his younger brother Henry as heir, in an arrangement that would eventually unravel an entire kingdom's relationship with the Catholic Church. Henry was later married to his brother's widow Catherine, under a special papal dispensation permitting the union. For years, that marriage seemed to work. Catherine was intelligent, devout, popular with the English people, and genuinely respected by her husband, for a time. But the marriage had one enormous unsolved problem. Catherine's pregnancies kept failing. She had at least 6 recorded pregnancies. Only one child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. This mattered enormously, and it is difficult from a modern vantage point to overstate how much it mattered. England had almost no precedent for a woman ruling in her own right. The closest historical example from the 12th century had ended in a prolonged civil war remembered as the Anarchy. Henry did not merely want a son out of vanity or ordinary paternal longing. He believed, and much of the political class around him believed that a kingdom without a clear male heir was a kingdom inviting catastrophe. Rival claimants, court factions each attaching themselves to a different potential successor, and quite possibly a war of succession like the Wars of the Roses that had torn England apart for decades before his own father took the throne. Henry's entire dynasty, the House of Tudor, was barely one generation deep. It could not yet survive an uncertain succession. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was in her 40s, and everyone at court, including Henry, understood that further pregnancies were increasingly unlikely. The king's need for a male heir had shifted in his own mind from a hope into something closer to a crisis. There is one more piece of context essential to understanding what came next: religion. In the early 16th century, the authority to dissolve a royal marriage rested not with any English court but with the Pope in Rome. A king could not simply divorce his wife. He needed the Church's permission to declare that his marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God in the first place. An annulment, not a divorce, built on a legal and theological argument. And in 1527, when Henry began seriously pursuing exactly this argument regarding his marriage to Catherine, he ran into an extraordinarily inconvenient political fact. The reigning Pope, Clement VII, was at that moment effectively a prisoner of the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be Catherine of Aragon's own nephew. The Pope had every political reason in the world not to humiliate the aunt of the man who controlled Rome. This was the world Anne Boleyn walked into when she returned to the English court in the early 1520s, a kingdom ruled by an increasingly anxious king, tied to a queen who could no longer give him what the dynasty needed, and standing on the edge of a religious and diplomatic crisis that had not yet fully declared itself. Anne did not create this crisis, but she was about to walk directly into the middle of it, and the collision between one young woman's return to court and one king's dynastic desperation would end up reshaping the religious identity of an entire nation. When Anne Boleyn arrived at the English court around 1522, she was not, at first, of any particular interest to the king. She took up a position as a maid of honour to Queen Catherine herself, a common role for well-connected young women, and one that placed Anne, ironically, inside the household of the very woman she would eventually help remove from the throne. Her first documented romantic entanglement at court was not with Henry at all, but with a young nobleman named Henry Percy, heir to the powerful earldom of Northumberland. The two appear to have formed a genuine attachment, possibly even an informal betrothal, the kind of unofficial understanding common enough among young courtiers, though the exact nature of it remains disputed among historians. What is not disputed is how it ended. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry VIII's chief minister and the most powerful churchman in England, intervened and broke the match, reportedly on the king's own orders. Percy was married off instead to a bride chosen by his family. Anne, by multiple accounts, was furious, and never forgave Wolsey for it. That grudge would matter enormously years later when Anne found herself in a position to help destroy the cardinal's career entirely. It was probably around 1526 that Henry VIII himself began to take a serious romantic interest in Anne. And here we should pause on something important. Henry had already had a mistress from the Boleyn family. Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn, had been the king's mistress years earlier, and some historians believe one or both of Mary's children may have been fathered by Henry, though this has never been proven and the king never acknowledged it. Whatever the precise truth, the Boleyn family was, by the mid-1520s, already familiar to Henry in the most intimate way a family could be familiar to a king. What made Anne different, and this is the detail that nearly every contemporary source agrees on, was that she refused to become what her sister had been. Henry's surviving love letters to Anne, a rare and remarkable set of documents preserved today in the Vatican Library, show a king increasingly desperate, increasingly frustrated, and increasingly captivated by a woman who would not simply accept his advances. Historians have long debated why Anne held out. It is possible she had watched her sister's experience as royal mistress, a position with intimacy but no lasting security, no title, and no protection once the king's interest inevitably moved elsewhere, and decided she would accept nothing less than marriage. It is possible her ambition, shaped by years in French royal households, made her unwilling to settle for less than a crown. It is possible, too, that she genuinely did not return Henry's feelings for years, and her refusals were not strategy at all, simply honesty. the surviving evidence does not allow us to know her true motivations with certainty. We only have Henry's side of the correspondence, since Anne's replies to him have not survived. What we do know is the effect of her refusal. By 1527, Henry VIII, King of England, was informing his own chief minister that he intended to seek an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a marriage of nearly 2 decades, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. At the time, almost nobody at court believed this was possible, or that it would take anything like the length of time it eventually did. Cardinal Wolsey, tasked with securing the annulment, believed he could manage the process through ordinary diplomatic channels with Rome. He was wrong. What followed instead was 6 years of legal argument, diplomatic manoeuvring, theological debate, and mounting international crisis, a period historians now call the King's Great Matter. And at the centre of it, watching her own future be decided by cardinals and lawyers and foreign ambassadors she had never met, was a woman in her 20s who had staked everything, her reputation, her family's fortunes, her entire future, on a marriage that for years showed no sign of ever actually happening. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to compress the King's Great Matter into a single dramatic scene. Henry demanding, Rome refusing, Anne waiting in the wings. The reality was slower, messier, and far more exhausting for everyone involved, Anne most of all. The core legal argument Henry's lawyers constructed rested on a passage from the Book of Leviticus, which pronounced a curse on any man who married his brother's widow. Henry had done exactly that when he married Catherine, and he now argued that his marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God, which was why, he claimed, God had denied him a surviving son. Catherine's lawyers countered with a passage from Deuteronomy that appeared to command the opposite, and with a more immediate factual claim, that her brief marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, meaning she had come to Henry's bed as a virgin, and the Leviticus prohibition therefore did not apply at all. Catherine held to this claim with total, unwavering conviction for the rest of her life. In 1529, a legatine court convened at Blackfriars in London to hear the case, with Cardinal Wolsey and a papal legate presiding. It produced one of the most famous scenes of Henry's reign. Catherine of Aragon, rather than accepting the court's jurisdiction, rose from her seat, walked across the room, knelt before her husband in front of the assembled court, and delivered a public appeal to his honour and their marriage, then rose, and walked out of the room entirely, refusing to return no matter how many times she was summoned. It was an extraordinary act of public defiance, from a woman with no other institutional power except her own dignity, and it worked in the sense that it made the king look, to many observers, like the aggressor in the story. The court adjourned without a ruling. The Pope, unwilling to alienate Catherine's nephew Emperor Charles V, eventually recalled the case to Rome itself, effectively ensuring it would never be decided at all, since a decision in Rome, under Charles's shadow, was never going to favour Henry. This failure destroyed Cardinal Wolsey. He had promised Henry an annulment and delivered nothing after 2 years of effort. Anne Boleyn, who had never forgiven Wolsey for breaking her engagement to Henry Percy, is widely believed by historians to have actively worked to turn the king against his own chief minister during this period, though, as with much of Anne's private influence, the exact scale of her role is disputed rather than fully documented. What is certain is the outcome. In 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his office as Lord Chancellor, and in 1530 he died while travelling south to face likely treason charges, a broken man. Wolsey's fall created a vacuum at the top of English government, and into it stepped a man who would become one of the most consequential figures of the entire Tudor period, Thomas Cromwell, a former member of Wolsey's own household, a lawyer of formidable intelligence, and a political operator without much sentiment for anyone who stood in his way. Cromwell would spend the next several years becoming indispensable to Henry, and, crucially, he would become the architect of the legal and religious mechanism that finally gave Henry what 6 years of ordinary diplomacy could not. That mechanism was radical. If Rome would not grant the annulment, Cromwell reasoned, then England would simply stop asking Rome's permission. Beginning in 1532 and continuing into 1533, a series of acts pushed through Parliament systematically cut off Rome's authority over the English Church, redirected certain church revenues to the Crown, and laid the legal foundation for an entirely new arrangement. The King of England, not the Pope, would be recognised as the supreme head of the Church in England. This was not merely a technical fix to Henry's marital problem. It was the beginning of the English Reformation, one of the most consequential religious and political transformations in the country's history, and it had been set in motion, in significant part, by one king's determination to marry one woman. We should be careful here about assigning Anne too much or too little credit for this transformation. Historians broadly agree that Anne had genuine sympathies with reformist religious ideas. She owned and circulated banned reformist texts, corresponded with reform-minded clergy, and would later use her position as queen to promote reformers to positions of influence within the church. Whether her personal convictions actively shaped the direction of the Reformation, or whether she was primarily a catalyst whose marital crisis gave ambitious reformers like Cromwell the political opening they needed, remains genuinely disputed among historians. What is not disputed is that by early 1533, with Cromwell's legal architecture largely in place, Henry finally moved. Anne was, by this point, already pregnant. This detail changes the entire shape of the story because it means the final push to marry her was not simply about desire or politics anymore. It was about time. If Henry's child with Anne was to be recognised as legitimate, the marriage needed to happen before the birth, and ideally as far before it as possible to avoid awkward questions about dates. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married in a secret ceremony, without waiting for any formal ruling on the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. It was, by the standards of the age, an audacious and legally precarious act, a king marrying a second wife, while still, in the eyes of Rome and much of Europe, married to his first. Thomas Cranmer, a reform-minded clergyman whom Henry had newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, provided the final piece. In May 1533, in his own ecclesiastical court, Cranmer formally declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. Days later, he declared Henry's marriage to Anne valid. Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had been Queen of England for over 2 decades, was informed she was no longer queen at all, but merely Princess Dowager of Wales, the title appropriate to a woman who had only ever been the widow of Prince Arthur. She refused for the rest of her life to accept the title or acknowledge the marriage's dissolution. She would die in 1536, still insisting to her final letter that she was the king's only true wife. For Anne, none of this cost was yet visible. In June 1533 she was crowned Queen of England in a lavish coronation at Westminster Abbey, the first English queen crowned with the ancient crown of Edward the Confessor, an honour even Catherine had never received, and a detail that tells us exactly how far Henry was willing to go to elevate her. 3 months later she gave birth to a daughter. We return now to the morning we began with, September the 7th, 1533, and a princess born where a prince had been promised. It is worth sitting with what that birth actually meant on every level, because its consequences rippled outward in several different directions at once. For Henry, the birth of Elizabeth was, in the moment, a disappointment, though perhaps a smaller one than later legend would suggest. He had, after all, just fathered a healthy child with a young wife, which was itself evidence, in the medical thinking of the time, that further pregnancies and eventually a son were entirely possible. The christening, held only days later, was a major state occasion, and the infant princess was given a name that connected her to both of Henry's parents' dynasties, Elizabeth, after Henry's own mother, Elizabeth of York. For Anne, the birth was something more complicated. She had entered marriage under the near-universal assumption, shared by physicians, astrologers, and the court itself, that she carried a son. The daughter she delivered instead was healthy, and in time would prove extraordinary. But in September 1533, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was a simple, brutal political fact. Anne had married a king who had broken with the Church of Rome, alienated one of the most powerful families in Europe, divided his own kingdom, and staked his entire dynasty's future, all in pursuit of a son. She had not yet delivered one. For the kingdom itself, the consequences were even larger. England in late 1533 was a country in genuine crisis, and not merely a political one. The break with Rome had produced real religious upheaval among ordinary people, many of whom remained devoutly Catholic, and viewed the new queen, and the entire process that had elevated her, with open hostility. Catherine of Aragon remained enormously popular. Crowds had cheered for her outside Blackfriars, and many in the country continued to regard her, not Anne, as the true queen. Anne's own household reported hostile crowds, insults shouted in the street, and at least one occasion where a mob nearly attacked her barge on the Thames, apparently mistaking another woman for the new queen and screaming abuse before realizing their error. At the time, this hostility may have seemed like the ordinary grumbling that follows any unpopular political change. It would prove to be something far more durable, a current of public sentiment that never fully disappeared during Anne's lifetime, and that her enemies would later be able to draw on when the time came to destroy her. Anne's position at court, meanwhile, was almost paradoxical. She held more formal power than any English consort in living memory. Henry consulted her on political matters, gave her a substantial household and income, and allowed her genuine influence over ecclesiastical appointments, promoting reform-minded clergymen to positions of authority within the church. She used this influence deliberately, championing scholars and preachers aligned with the new, religious thinking spreading across Europe, funding poor relief and educational projects, and positioning herself, by several historical accounts, as a genuinely engaged and serious political actor rather than merely a royal ornament. But that same power made her enemies. The old nobility, much of it still loyal in spirit to Catherine, resented a courtier's daughter, however cultured, however clever, elevated above them. Conservative churchmen loathed her reformist sympathies. Ordinary people, fed by rumour and by genuine religious conviction, associated her with the destruction of a beloved queen and a familiar church. And within the court itself, Anne's sharp tongue and refusal to defer quietly, the very qualities that had made her so magnetic to Henry during years of courtship, now struck many observers as arrogance in a queen. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a committed partisan of Catherine's who never once, in his voluminous surviving correspondence, referred to Anne as anything but the concubine, recorded courtiers' complaints about her temper, her jealousy, her sharp public arguments with Henry. We should treat Chapuis' accounts with real caution. He was, by his own admission, an enemy of Anne's from the very beginning, writing to advance Catherine's cause and later Mary's. But even setting aside his obvious bias, a consistent picture emerges from multiple sources. Anne Boleyn as queen was not a passive, decorative figure. She argued. She pushed. She expected to be heard, and she often was. It had won Henry's devotion for 7 long years of courtship. It would prove far more dangerous once she was his wife rather than his pursuit, because a mistress who challenges a king is fascinating, while a wife who challenges a king once his interest wanes is merely difficult, and Henry's interest, as we'll see, did not remain fixed forever. The very qualities that had made Anne different from every other woman at court, her wit, her independence, her refusal to simply agree, began, within only a few years of marriage, to wear against a king who had never in his life tolerated being contradicted for long. Let us pause here, at roughly the midpoint of this story, and take stock of how far we have come. Anne Boleyn had entered the English court as the polished, French-educated daughter of an ambitious diplomat, a young woman of no extraordinary rank, whose only real asset was her own intelligence and charm. She had refused a king's advances for years, watched that refusal reshape the religious landscape of an entire country, and emerged, against every reasonable expectation, as Queen of England, crowned with the crown of Edward the Confessor, a wife whose marriage had cost Henry his relationship with the Pope, with the Holy Roman Emperor, and with a significant portion of his own kingdom's affections for the woman she had replaced. She had achieved something almost no woman of her era could have imagined achieving, and already, less than a year into her marriage, the ground beneath her was less stable than it appeared. She had given Henry a healthy child, but not the son the entire marriage had been built to produce. She had made bitter enemies among the old nobility and the religious conservatives, whose resentment she had done relatively little to soften. She had lost, in Wolsey, an enemy she had helped destroy, but in doing so had cleared a path for Thomas Cromwell, a man who owed her no particular loyalty, and who was, first and foremost, loyal to whatever arrangement best served Henry, and not incidentally himself. And she had married a king who, by every account of his character across a 5-decade reign, valued nothing more consistently than getting exactly what he wanted, and who had a documented history, 1 wife's worth of history already, and eventually 4 more, of losing interest entirely once he did not get it. The next several years would test every part of Anne's position at once: her marriage, her influence over religious policy, her standing with Cromwell, and above all her ability to do the one thing the entire upheaval had supposedly been for: provide Henry with a living son. 20 years earlier, a girl at Hever Castle could not have imagined any of this awaiting her. Now, holding the highest position an Englishwoman could hold, she was about to discover that a crown she had waited 7 years to win could become, in the span of just a few more, a trap with no clear way out. The years immediately following Elizabeth's birth were marked by a pattern that would define, and ultimately doom, Anne's marriage. Pregnancy, hope, and loss repeated. In the summer of 1534, Anne appears to have been pregnant again, though the pregnancy either ended in miscarriage or, by some accounts, may not have progressed as far as believed in the first place. The surviving records are frustratingly thin on this point, and historians differ on exactly what happened. What is clear is that no child arrived, and that the disappointment registered at court. Then, in January 1536, came the loss that historians generally regard as the true turning point of the marriage. Anne miscarried a fetus that observers at the time described as male, at roughly 15 or 16 weeks, devastating not merely as a personal loss, but as a dynastic one, since it appeared to confirm in the anxious calculus of the age that Anne might never deliver the son the entire marriage had been built to produce. The timing of this miscarriage carried an almost unbearable symbolic weight. It occurred on the very day of Catherine of Aragon's funeral. Catherine had died 3 weeks earlier, on January 7, 1536, still insisting to her final letter, addressed to Henry himself, that she was his only true and loving wife. Her death should, in theory, have strengthened Anne's position enormously. With Catherine gone, the question of whether Henry's first marriage had been valid became, in practical terms, moot, and Anne's own status as queen was no longer contested by a living rival. Contemporary accounts describe Henry and Anne both dressing in celebratory yellow upon hearing news of Catherine's death, a detail that has scandalised readers for centuries, though historians note that yellow carried different mourning associations in different courts of the period, and the gesture may have been less callous than it now appears. Whatever the truth of that detail, the miscarriage that followed on the day of Catherine's funeral undid whatever relief her death might have provided. According to one of the few surviving accounts, when Henry visited Anne after the miscarriage, she reportedly blamed her distress at his open attention to another woman at court, a remark that, if accurately recorded, tells us something important. Anne already understood by early 1536 that her husband's affections were drifting elsewhere. That other woman was Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who had served both Catherine and Anne, and whose quiet, demure temperament stood in almost calculated contrast to everything that had made Anne so captivating a decade earlier. Where Anne had been witty, outspoken, and unwilling to simply yield to Henry's advances, Jane was, by every surviving description, gentle, modest, and, crucially in the political calculations already forming around her, entirely uncontroversial. The Seymour family, sensing opportunity, began positioning Jane much as the Boleyns had once positioned Anne herself, encouraging her to accept the king's attention while withholding anything more, ensuring that Henry's interest would only deepen. We should notice the historical irony here, because contemporaries at the time certainly did. Anne Boleyn's entire rise to power had depended on a strategy of patient refusal that made a king's desire grow more desperate over years. Now, barely 3 years into her marriage, a new woman was deploying the identical strategy against her, and Henry, whose temperament had not fundamentally changed, was responding to it in exactly the way he once had to Anne. By the spring of 1536, then, several separate currents were converging at once. Henry's patience for a marriage that had cost him so much and delivered so little, one living daughter, several miscarriages, and no son, was thinning visibly. A new woman, backed by an ambitious family, was positioning herself as an alternative, and crucially, the one man whose administrative and legal skill had made Anne's marriage possible in the first place, Thomas Cromwell, was about to become her enemy. To understand Anne's downfall, we have to understand what had gone wrong between her and Thomas Cromwell, a man who, only a few years earlier, had engineered the entire legal apparatus that made her queen in the first place. For every major figure in this final act, we should ask the same questions we would ask of any character locked in a genuine conflict. Who were they? What did they want? And why couldn't they simply walk away? Cromwell wanted, above all, to remain useful to Henry. His entire career, his fortune, and eventually his life depended on it, a fact he understood better than almost anyone else at court. By 1536, Cromwell had also begun pursuing an ambitious project close to Anne's own reformist sympathies, the dissolution of England's monasteries, a policy that would eventually transfer enormous wealth from the church to the crown. Here, historians identify a genuine and significant point of friction. Anne, despite her reformist religious leanings, believed strongly that revenue from dissolved monasteries should be redirected toward charitable and educational purposes, poor relief, scholarships, hospitals, rather than simply absorbed into the royal treasury or redistributed to courtiers. Cromwell, whose approach was more pragmatic and more oriented towards strengthening the crown's finances and rewarding the political allies the crown depended on, disagreed. By the spring of 1536, this disagreement had become an open and bitter one, with one of Anne's own chaplains publicly criticising Cromwell's approach in a sermon delivered in front of the entire court, an unmistakable declaration of where the Queen's faction stood. This is the essential context historians point to when explaining what happened next. Cromwell did not merely lose an ally in Anne, he gained, in the spring of 1536, an active and dangerous political enemy, one with the Queen's own influence over Henry behind her. And Cromwell, whatever else can be said about him, was not a man inclined to wait passively to see whether that enemy would move against him first. It is at this point that the historical evidence becomes genuinely contested, and any honest account of Anne Boleyn's fall has to acknowledge real uncertainty about exactly what happened and why. What we know for certain is this. In April and early May of 1536, accusations began to circulate, first quietly, then with startling speed and specificity, that Queen Anne had committed adultery with multiple men at court, including a court musician named Mark Smeaton, several gentlemen of the King's own privy chamber, and, in the most shocking accusation of all, her own brother, George Boleyn, on a charge of incest. Historians today overwhelmingly regard these charges as almost certainly fabricated. The dates and locations alleged in the official indictments often do not match where Anne is independently known to have been at the time, and the entire case rested heavily on a single confession from Mark Smeaton, extracted after what most historians believe involved coercion or torture, since he was the only one of the accused men who did not maintain his innocence to the end. What remains genuinely disputed is why the charges emerged when they did, and who was principally responsible for orchestrating them. One prominent historical interpretation holds that Cromwell, having identified Anne as a mortal threat to his own position and possibly his life, moved deliberately and preemptively to destroy her before she could destroy him, constructing, with the help of Anne's known court enemies, a case that gave Henry exactly what Henry, consciously or not, may already have wanted: an exit from an increasingly unwelcome marriage that did not require the kind of prolonged, humiliating legal battle his split from Catherine had involved. A competing interpretation places less emphasis on deliberate Cromwell orchestration and more on a genuine, rapidly escalating court panic and factional opportunism, in which rumour, resentment, and Henry's own visible interest in Jane Seymour combined to produce a case that took on a momentum of its own once it began. What we can say with confidence is this: whatever combination of forces set events in motion, they moved with extraordinary speed, and once they began, nothing Anne said or did seemed able to slow them down. On May Day, 1536, Anne Boleyn watched a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace beside her husband, apparently unaware that the ground had already shifted decisively beneath her. Henry left abruptly partway through the event, a departure that, in hindsight, marked the moment the machinery already set in motion could no longer be stopped. The court musician Mark Smeaton had been arrested and interrogated the day before, and by some accounts had already confessed, whether freely or under duress, to a sexual relationship with the Queen. The following day, May 2nd, 1536, Anne herself was arrested and brought by barge to the Tower of London, the same fortress where, only 3 years earlier, she'd stayed in royal apartments the night before her own coronation, greeted then with cannon fire and celebration. She reportedly asked the men escorting her whether she was to be taken to a dungeon, and was told, with what must have felt like a small and terrible mercy, that she would instead be lodged in the same rooms she had occupied before her coronation. Over the following days, her brother George Boleyn and 4 other men, Smeaton, along with courtiers Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston, were also arrested and charged alongside her. Contemporary accounts describe Anne, during her imprisonment, swinging between defiant composure and visible distress, at times reportedly laughing and at other times weeping, a pattern the Constable of the Tower, William Kingston, recorded in letters that survive to this day and remain one of our most direct windows into her state of mind during this period. She repeatedly protested her innocence, asked after her daughter Elizabeth, and appears to have genuinely struggled to comprehend how quickly her position had collapsed. The men were tried first on May 12th, and all convicted largely on the strength of Smeaton's confession, despite the others maintaining their innocence throughout. Anne and George Boleyn were tried separately on May 15th, before a court of peers that included, in one of the story's bitterest ironies, Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presiding as Lord High Steward. Both were convicted. The specific charges against Anne included adultery with the accused men, incest with her brother, and, in the charge that legally mattered most, conspiring to procure the king's death, since any of these acts, if true, would have constituted treason against the crown itself. Contemporary observers, including several who had no particular sympathy for Anne, noted the thinness of the evidence and the speed of the proceedings. The case against her rested almost entirely on rumour, a coerced confession from one man who was not even a nobleman, and testimony extracted under circumstances that would not withstand serious legal scrutiny by almost any standard, then or now. But English treason trials of the period were not designed to produce acquittals for anyone the Crown had already decided to convict, and Anne, like her brother and the other men, was sentenced to death. Her sentence, read aloud in court, offered Henry a choice between two methods of execution: burning, the traditional penalty for a woman convicted of treason, or beheading, and it fell to the king himself to decide his own wife's manner of death. Henry chose beheading, and in a further almost surreal concession, arranged for a swordsman to be brought specially from Calais in France, since English executioners at the time used an axe, and the French method, a single clean stroke from a sword, performed by a skilled specialist, was considered swifter and more merciful. We should not read this mercy as tenderness. It is, if anything, one of the most chilling details of the entire episode. A king who had once written passionate love letters begging for Anne's affection, now arranging, with careful attention to procedure, the most efficient possible manner of taking her life. Anne Boleyn was executed on the morning of May 19th, 1536, on a specially constructed scaffold within the walls of the Tower of London. A private execution, away from the usual public grounds, one of the few considerations extended to her as a former queen. She reportedly spent her final hours in prayer and in conversation with her almoner, and by the account of the Constable of the Tower, appeared calm, even composed, in her final morning, a striking contrast to the emotional volatility recorded in the preceding weeks. Whether this composure reflected genuine peace, resignation, or simply the discipline of a woman who understood that her final public act would be remembered, and wanted to control how, we cannot know for certain. Her final speech, delivered from the scaffold and recorded by multiple witnesses, has survived in something close to its original form, and it is worth noting how carefully it was constructed. She did not protest her innocence outright. Doing so publicly could have endangered her family, particularly her young daughter, Elizabeth, since a public accusation against the king's justice would have been its own kind of treason. Instead, she praised Henry as a good and gentle prince, asked the crowd to pray for the king, and commended her soul to God, offering nothing that could be used against her family after her death. It was, by any reading, an extraordinarily controlled final performance from a woman with every reason to be anything but controlled. The execution itself was swift, by contemporary accounts, exactly as the choice of a skilled swordsman had been intended to ensure. Her body and severed head were placed in a narrow chest, no coffin having been prepared, in a detail that speaks to how quickly and almost carelessly the entire process had been arranged, and buried in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, inside the tower walls near the scaffold where she died. 11 days later, on May 30th, 1536, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. We should sit with that timeline, because its speed tells us something essential about the entire episode. 11 days between the execution of one wife and the marriage of the next is not the timeline of a grieving widower slowly processing an unbearable betrayal. It is the timeline of a king who had already decided, well before the trial concluded, exactly where his future lay, and who regarded his second marriage, by the time it ended, as an obstacle to be removed rather than a bond to be mourned. Anne Boleyn was 35 years old, or perhaps 29, depending on which disputed birth year one accepts. She had been Queen of England for 3 years and a few months. Historical documentaries often end at the scaffold. This story has to continue a little further, because Anne Boleyn's death did not simply close a chapter. It opened several others that would unfold across the rest of the century. For Henry, Anne's fall cleared the way not only for his marriage to Jane Seymour, but for a broader campaign to erase Anne from the official record of his reign. Their daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old at the time of her mother's execution, was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament within weeks, stripped of her position as princess and reduced, in official status, to the same diminished rank her own half-sister Mary had once been forced into after Catherine's marriage was annulled. Elizabeth's household was reduced, her position at court made uncertain, and for years afterward she grew up in a strange, unstable status. Acknowledged as the king's daughter, yet formally illegitimate, her mother's name essentially unspeakable at court. Jane Seymour, for her part, gave Henry the son he had wanted for over a decade. Edward, born in October 1537, but died less than 2 weeks later from complications of childbirth, becoming, in the strange arithmetic of Henry's 6 marriages, the wife he would later choose to be buried beside. George Boleyn's widow, Jane Boleyn, whose testimony is sometimes cited with real historical uncertainty as having contributed to the incest accusations against her own husband and sister-in-law, would herself be executed years later, in 1542, for her role in the downfall of Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, a grim reminder of how thoroughly the machinery that destroyed Anne could, and eventually did, turn on others who had once helped operate it. Thomas Cromwell, whose manoeuvring, whatever its precise extent, had done so much to bring Anne down, did not long outlive his rival. He fell from Henry's favour in 1540, over his role in arranging the king's disastrous 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves, and was executed on Tower Hill that same year, beheaded like the Queen whose downfall he had helped engineer, on the orders of the same king both had once served so effectively. And Elizabeth, the daughter born on that disappointing morning at Greenwich in 1533, grew up in the shadow of her mother's disgrace, was formally restored to the line of succession later in her father's reign, survived the brief and turbulent reigns of her half-siblings Edward and Mary, and in 1558 became Queen Elizabeth I of England. She reigned for 45 years, one of the longest and most celebrated reigns in English history, and she did so, by the observation of numerous historians, in ways that seemed to echo her mother's own qualities: intelligence, verbal wit, a fierce insistence on control over her own image, and an acute understanding of how quickly a woman's power at court could be taken away. Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother publicly. The subject remained, throughout her reign, a delicate and largely avoided one, but she is known to have worn a ring containing a hidden portrait of Anne, discovered only after Elizabeth's own death in 1603, a private and quietly devastating piece of evidence that the daughter never forgot the mother she had lost before she was 3 years old. Much of the image we have of Anne Boleyn today was not created during her lifetime. It was created over the centuries that followed, by people who each had their own reasons for remembering her in a particular way. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, official Tudor accounts painted her almost entirely through Henry's own justification: an adulterous, treacherous wife who had received the justice she deserved. This was, of course, the only version of events that could be safely repeated at court while Henry lived, and it shaped English chronicles for a generation. Catholic writers on the continent, hostile to the entire Reformation, Anne's marriage had helped set in motion, went further still, portraying her as something close to a villain of nearly demonic proportion, the chief architect of England's break from Rome, blamed not only for her own supposed sins, but for the religious upheaval of an entire nation. The reign of her own daughter began, slowly and carefully, to shift the picture. Elizabeth I never rehabilitated her mother's reputation loudly or officially. Doing so would have raised uncomfortable questions about the king's justice and about Elizabeth's own contested legitimacy. But Protestant writers during Elizabeth's reign, most influentially the martyrologist John Fox, began recasting Anne not as Henry's official version had painted her, but as a genuine supporter of religious reform, a patron of reformers and scholars, a woman whose fall had been engineered by Catholic-leaning enemies at court, rather than deserved through any real guilt. This version of Anne, reform-minded, wrongly accused, a quiet architect of Protestant England, became the dominant narrative for much of the following century, propelled largely by the fact that her daughter now sat on the throne, and an English Protestant national identity had enormous political use for a sympathetic account of how that Protestant future had first taken root. In the centuries since, Anne's reputation has continued to shift with the concerns of whoever is doing the remembering. Victorian historians working within their own era's assumptions about female virtue and domestic morality often portrayed her alternately as a scheming social climber or as a tragic wronged wife, depending on the author's particular sympathies. 20th and 21st century historians, armed with more rigorous archival methods and considerably more scepticism toward Tudor court propaganda in either direction, have generally moved toward the interpretation now most widely accepted by academic historians, that the charges against her in 1536 were almost certainly fabricated, that she was very likely the victim of a fast-moving combination of court factionalism, Cromwell's political self-preservation, and Henry's own restless search for an exit from an unwanted marriage, but that she was also, in her lifetime, a genuinely formidable political actor in her own right, not merely a passive victim of the men around her, whose religious patronage and personal influence over Henry left real and lasting marks on English history, independent of how her story ended. Popular culture, meanwhile, has told her story in every register imaginable, as romance, as tragedy, as feminist reclamation, as Gothic horror, as television drama, and the sheer volume and variety of these retellings is itself a piece of historical evidence of a kind. Nearly 500 years after her death, Anne Boleyn remains one of the most written about, argued over, and imaginatively reinvented women in English history. Very few of her contemporaries, male or female, have proven anywhere near as durable a subject of fascination. What nearly all of these retellings share, whatever their era or their sympathies, is the same unresolved question we opened this documentary with. Who was she, really? A calculating opportunist who reshaped a kingdom's religion to satisfy her own ambition, a genuine reformer whose convictions helped bring Protestantism to England, a woman who simply refused to accept less than what any king's mistress before her had settled for, and paid with her life for that refusal? The honest answer, built from everything the surviving evidence allows us to say with real confidence, is very likely some combination of all three, a woman whose ambition, intelligence, and genuine convictions cannot be neatly separated from one another, and whose story resists exactly the kind of simple judgment each generation has nonetheless kept trying to impose on it. So, who was Anne Boleyn, really? What she accomplished is not in serious dispute. She held a King of England's devotion for the better part of a decade, in an era when royal mistresses were expected to yield quietly and disappear. She helped precipitate, whether by conviction or circumstance or both, one of the most consequential religious transformations in English history, the break from Rome that eventually made England a Protestant nation. She used her brief years as queen to promote religious reform, patronize scholarship and fund charitable works, leaving a mark on English religious life that outlasted her by generations. And she gave birth to a daughter who would go on to become, by almost any measure, one of the most successful monarchs in English history, a woman who ruled alone without a husband for 45 years in a kingdom that had once been told, repeatedly and urgently, that it needed a son. What she failed to accomplish is equally clear. She did not deliver the male heir her entire marriage had been built around. She did not secure lasting political alliances strong enough to protect her once Henry's affection cooled. And she did not survive the collision between her own outspoken independence and a court culture that had never quite decided whether it wanted a queen who challenged the king or merely one who charmed him. What later generations misunderstood, or more precisely what different generations understood differently according to their own needs, was almost everything about her. She has been recast as villain, victim, saint, seductress, martyr, and schemer, sometimes within the same century, occasionally within the same decade. Very little of that variation reflects new evidence about who she actually was. Most of it reflects what each era needed her to represent. So we are left in the end with the same central historical debate that has never been fully settled. Was Anne Boleyn the architect of her own downfall? A woman whose ambition and refusal to soften her own sharp edges made her enemies she could never fully overcome? Or was she trapped from the very beginning in forces far larger than any one woman could control? A king's dynastic anxiety, a chief minister's political self-interest, a court culture with no real template for a queen who insisted on being heard. The evidence supports both readings, and historians continue to argue over which one deserves more weight. Perhaps the truest thing we can say is this. Anne Boleyn spent nearly a decade of her life inside a system that offered exceptional women exactly two roles: decorative silence or destruction. For a few remarkable years, she found a third path that almost nobody before her had managed: real influence, a real voice, a real crown. It did not last, but it existed, and the daughter she left behind spent 45 years proving that it had not been an accident. In the end, Anne Boleyn did not lose because she stopped fighting. She lost because the world she was fighting inside of had never actually made room for a woman like her to win for very long. What do you think?